You call it independence. Other people call it strength. But what if it started as something else entirely? Something that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with not getting hurt again? What if the most admired thing about you is also the most defended? There was a version of you that tried. You asked. You reached towards someone during something genuinely hard, and what came back wasn't what you needed. Not always cruelty. Sometimes it was a parent at a dinner table who turned the conversation back toward their own day before you'd finished your sentence. A friend who responded to your carefully worded text with a voice note about their own situation. A moment where you came apart slightly, and the person across from you looked uncomfortable, or distracted, or simply didn't know what to do with it. Nothing catastrophic, just insufficient, repeatedly, and that was enough. You didn't make a decision. Something inside you contracted, and adjusted, and moved on. The adjustment was quiet, final, and over time, it became so automatic you stopped noticing it was happening at all. Before that contraction fully settled, you were probably the kind of person who read rooms. No one taught you this. You developed it the way any organism develops a useful sense, because the environment rewarded it. You walked into spaces and clocked the tension between two people who'd just argued, the specific quality of apparent stillness that meant tonight would require careful navigation, the smile that didn't reach someone's eyes. You also became useful before anyone could decide you were a burden. In friendships, you showed up, practically, reliably, without needing recognition for it. You held people during their hard things, and when something was hard for you, you processed it alone and mentioned it afterward, past tense, sealed, almost as an aside. Yeah, last year was rough, already over, already handled. In relationships, there was always a specific moment, usually early, when someone offered help with something ordinary, and instead of simple gratitude, you felt something uncomfortable, slightly cornered. You probably told yourself it was because you didn't want to owe anyone anything, but that wasn't the whole truth. The fuller truth was this: accepting help meant confirming that you needed it, and needing something from someone was a position you had learned very precisely not to occupy. So you declined, warmly, convincingly, and you handled it yourself, again. At some point, the strategy became invisible to you. It stopped being something you did and became something you were. Self-sufficient, resourceful, the one who doesn't require much. And then, quietly, usually in the middle of something genuinely difficult, you caught yourself not even generating the thought of asking. No internal debate, no suppression, just absence. The option didn't occur to you, and, for a moment, you noticed that absence. Something inside you went still, not devastated, just, oh. It's been this way for a long time. If you're still here, this part matters. There is a psychologist named Bowlby who spent decades documenting what happens to children when their environment doesn't respond consistently to their distress. His finding wasn't that those children were broken. It was that they adapted, intelligently, precisely. They modified their behavior to maintain closeness to the people they depended on, given the emotional conditions they were actually living in. One of those adaptations is what researchers call avoidant attachment. The name sounds clinical. What it actually describes is a child who made a rational calculation. If signaling distress reliably produces the wrong response, then signaling distress is a losing strategy. They didn't stop feeling, they stopped transmitting. Mary Ainsworth later documented what was happening inside those children while their faces stayed composed. Their bodies were in alarm, their faces just didn't move. Researchers measured it. The distress was fully present, contained, not absent. They had severed the connection between inner experience and outer signal, and once that severance is learned early, it becomes one of the most automatic things a person does. Pause for a second. That is not a disorder. That is a nervous system that learned to protect itself using the most sophisticated tool available to it: concealment. The environment that teaches this lesson doesn't need a villain. Sometimes it was a parent whose own anxiety occupied every room, loving, present, genuinely trying, but so preloaded with their own unprocessed weight that your distress had nowhere to land. You learned not to add to something already bending. Sometimes it was a family that prized stoicism, not as cruelty, but as genuine philosophy. You watched the adults handle things quietly, move forward without dwelling, treat emotion as something to be managed, and you loved them. And you became like them, the way children always become like the people they love. Sometimes it was simpler. The one time you came apart in front of someone, the response made the falling apart feel worse than the original pain. And that is enough. That is genuinely enough. Now here's the part almost no one tells you. Most content about this pattern will stop at compassion. Will tell you it made sense. It was adaptive. You did what you had to do. And that's true. But it's not the complete picture. Sometimes the self-sufficiency isn't just protection. Sometimes it's control. If you never need anyone, no one can disappoint you. But they also can't fully matter. And that position feels safer, elevated, untouchable. If you are always the one who holds rather than being held, you maintain a subtle advantage in every dynamic, one where you cannot be failed because you never gave anyone the chance to show up. There is a quiet, unconscious superiority in that. Not malicious, but real. And sometimes, someone did try to get close. They offered, and reached, and made space. And after enough declined invitations, they stopped. Not dramatically. They just quietly recalibrated their understanding of what you were available for. And the distance you told yourself you preferred became the distance they gave you, which is what you said you wanted, on paper, which didn't feel the way you expected. Notice what just happened in you just now. There is also a specific loneliness that builds inside people who are too competent to ask for anything. Not the loud loneliness of isolation, the other kind, the loneliness of being consistently seen as fine, of having people stop checking in because you've trained them through months and years of handled it to assume you don't require it. And somewhere in there, a resentment accumulates. Not at anyone specifically, just a dull, unattributed ache that you're doing more than your share of the relational labor, invisibly, in every room you're in, without acknowledgement. Or you can keep doing what you've always done. The body does not participate in your strategy. James Pennebaker, a researcher at the University of Texas, spent years studying what happens inside people who consistently withhold distressing emotional experience. Across multiple studies through the 1980s and 1990s, he found it consistently: measurable immune suppression, elevated cardiovascular stress markers, higher rates of stress-related illness. The body keeps a ledger. It never forgets. It records everything you decided not to say, and it presents the bill slowly. Intention, fatigue, the kind of tiredness that sleep doesn't fix. That isn't a threat. It's meant to make the cost visible because you've spent a long time not looking directly at it. And if you felt slightly exposed just now, that's not an accident. What you've built is real. The perceptual system you developed, the room reading, the ability to sense when warmth is performed versus genuine, to identify the exact moment a dynamic shifts before anyone has said anything. That is not anxiety. That is calibrated social intelligence, sharpened over years of necessity. Most people never develop it because they never needed to. You needed to, so you did. That capacity has protected you from things that would have cost you significantly had you been less attuned. The goal isn't to dismantle it. The goal, if there is one, is to let it operate alongside something it currently tends to override: evidence. The accumulated, consistent evidence of people who have, over time and across circumstances, demonstrated that they can be trusted with your actual experience. Not all people, not immediately, but some, when the record supports it. The language usually applied to what you do is avoidance, emotional walls, isolation. Each of those words carries a verdict, that something in you failed to open when it should have. A more precise word is discernment, the hard-won, practiced ability to assess what a situation can actually hold before placing yourself inside it. Another word is sovereignty, a self with a center of gravity independent of who is or isn't available, that does not require external validation to remain intact. These aren't euphemisms. They describe something real, the outcome of a strategy that worked, running past the conditions that required it. The question is only whether those conditions have changed. You survived by not asking. That was real strength. But strength evolves, and maybe the next version of it isn't silence. Maybe it's selective, evidence-based trust, extended slowly to the people who have earned it, in the moments when the cost of withholding finally outweighs the cost of reaching. You don't have to become someone who processes aloud or leans openly or asks for everything. You just have to be willing to consider that the room you're in now might have different walls than the one where you learned this. If this felt uncomfortably accurate, leave one word in the comments: learned, or braced, or tired. You'll know which one fits.